The real estate market is shifting, market forces are changing, and you need to understand how we got to this point so that you can orient yourself towards future success here in the Florida real estate market. Welcome to Curbstone Consulting. My name is George. Let's get started. First, let's take a broad overview of the conditions which led us to this point. Prior to the pandemic, between the years of 2016 and 2019, monetary policy changes in the Federal Open Market Committee alters its post-recessionary target rate. For the first time following the Great Financial Crisis, we begin to see rate hikes, only to change course shortly thereafter in 2019 when Fed Chair Jerome Powell calls a mid-cycle adjustment to policy. But what comes on the heels of this adjustment is emergency rate cuts. Now, keep in mind that when the decennial census was taken in 2020, it was right as the pandemic was unfolding, meaning that enumeration was being conducted precisely when there was volatility and large-scale demographic changes about to be underway. As you navigate your market, be sure to take into account the long-term effects of net migration trends and seek to understand how that volatility settled. For example, here in Florida, the 2-year growth in sales volume over the course of 2020 and 2021 has now seen a 26.5% 2-year decline since that time. Just to give you an idea of the significance of the population growth recently, if you go to the Census Government website and view the quick facts table for Marion County, what you'll observe is that between the previous two recording periods, the population change from 2010 to 2020 was 44,610 residents. That's about a 13.5% increase. From April 2020 and through July 2023, the estimated population change in real terms was about 34,000. That's a 9% increase in simply 3 years. Yet, despite this demography, housing inventory is surging well above pre-pandemic levels. The effects of positive net migration has been seemingly made redundant by the overall market forces, and Marion County is not the only county in Florida experiencing these drastic changing conditions. So we go from 4 decades of stimulus, of what you may have heard economists refer to as cheap credit, access to cheap credit. As the Fed funds rate progressively lowers over this time period, reaching its apotheosis in response to the pandemic, those rates near zero again. Looking back now, it's easy to see that lending activity was signaling things to come. In 2020, as rates plummet right before the spring housing market gets underway, a refinance trend takes off, which extends through and peaks in March of 2021. This is the same month that the third round of stimulus checks were issued. We had the hottest spring market on record. 6.1 million homes were sold nationally that year, the highest to date. If rates had continued to climb from that mid-cycle adjustment in 2019, it is highly unlikely we would have seen the kinds of equity extraction and refinance demand. This was induced by the response to various exogenous factors which sent the world into crisis mode. As a result, $430 billion was excised from this refinancing activity, along with another 9 million people who renegotiated their loans to lower their monthly housing costs. With added demand from investors, people taking on second and third homes, rental vacancy rates plummeting, stimulus checks, demographic shifts, and hyperliquidity due to favorable interest rates, sales volume remains high into the first quarter of 2022, and then the Fed pivots, begins to hike, and demand is almost instantaneously zapped. We reversed nearly 7 years of growth in home sales, and presently it would appear to be on a 3-year downward trend here in Florida. Pressure builds on the part of intermediaries because borrowing conditions have drastically changed. The infinitely ideal utopia through which the debt cycle is fueled begins to collapse as the rate environment reverses and refinancing no longer makes any sense. What are the effects? Mortgage originations from 2021 to 2022 fall by 44%, the majority of which occur in refinance. First lien, second residences, and first lien investment properties decline drastically. Less so in the investment bracket, but still nonetheless. But here's the tangible number that makes sense to most consumers. The average monthly payment, excluding taxes and insurance, for borrowers taking out a conventional conforming 30-year fixed rate mortgage rose from $1,400 in December 2021 to $2,045 in December 2022, a 46.1% increase in 1 year. Keep in mind that inflation is hitting the consumer from many other directions as well, putting increasing pressure on consumers to justify the cost of holding long-duration assets. All this being said, the residential real estate market is still in a state of flux. Many entities on the sell side are piggybacking off the momentum of the previous period, believing in market conditions that were once true in the hope of selling their homes at extortionate prices. Regardless of the new housing market dynamic, price stability, though improving, has failed to return. The damage was inflicted with regard to price stability when we entered the period of emergency rate cuts. As you may know, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate: to stabilize prices by controlling inflation and to maximize employment. Its monetary policy, however, came at a time when public health mandates were restricting mobility, and that is putting it very mildly. On the one hand, lowered borrowing costs induce hyperliquidity in the markets. On the other hand, governments and private institutions are penalizing Americans for not following restrictive mandates. Enter the remote buyer and various forms of economic dislocation, such as remote work, which induce further speculation, and home prices are set ablaze. We still have not come down from this high, but the future is looking brighter and brighter every day. In a world where the debt ceiling can be raised infinitely without consequence, I suppose you can make the argument that a debt-fueled economy is perfectly reasonable and that imprudent spending habits can be justified because, after all, just put it on credit and deal with the consequences later or never. To some extent, I sympathize because the economic incentives have driven this kind of crazy consumer behavior. The problem of growth being predicated on taking out excessive amounts of debt, however, is that it cultivates a culture of distrust, both nationally and internationally. When the debt cycle is no longer sustainable, conversations shift from monetary policy to fiscal policy, and that conversation is becoming more and more animated, especially as narratives like we are going to rob our kids of their future begin to weigh more heavily on an up-and-coming American generation. My point being is that we need to emerge from this transition and nascent economy as being more productive, more efficient, more innovative, and optimistic about the future. It is hard to do that when you begin from behind, paying ridiculous costs to hold an overpriced asset. My intent on this channel is to help you discover where the value is by teaching fundamentals of real estate.